Thank you for inviting me back, Julie. It's always nice to be here. And the share screen is working. Okay, great. All right, well, thanks to my daughter, we have beautiful backgrounds in the PowerPoint. And that was her one fun part, she said. Okay. Ask the question, what's in a miracle? And what's the connection between Hanukkah and miracles? On the Hanukkah candles tonight, we made 3 brachot, 3 blessings here in Israel. Around the world, people will make them also. And on all of the other nights of Hanukkah, we'll make 2 blessings. The first blessing is the blessing on being commanded to light Hanukkah candles, even though it's a rabbinic mitzvah, right? It wasn't written in the Torah. The Torah includes a mitzvah, a commandment, that we're supposed to listen to the authorities in each generation. And so when rabbis of a later generation commanded something, that takes on the status of being a commandment because we're thereby following the commandment of listening to the rabbis. That's the first bracha that we make, the first blessing we make over the Hanukkah candles. The second blessing, we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. We credit God for performing miracles for our ancestors during this season, at these days, right? Back in those days historically, at this time during this season. So we introduce our act of lighting the Hanukkah candles by acknowledging that this is to commemorate miracles, in the plural, that were performed for our ancestors way back when, at this time. So our goal is to be able to see what the miracles of Hanukkah are, and to talk a little bit about what's this concept called a miracle. Right? The word miracle is a very easy word to kind of throw around, right? But as we'll see in a minute, it's a little bit more complex than that. Right? A miracle, we most often think, is something that is out of the ordinary, right? Somebody would say they had a miraculous recovery, right? Or they want a miraculous victory in a battle. But what does that word actually mean? What's interesting is that in medieval Jewish thought, there were different approaches to the concept of miracle, and they connect to some larger philosophical issues that medieval Jews were grappling with. So since this isn't a course in medieval philosophy, we'll scratch the surface, we'll give a little bit, hopefully give you a little bit of things to think about, and then we'll come back to the Hanukkah story. We'll talk about its historical background, we'll talk about what are the miracles that happened there, and hopefully we'll have a better appreciation for how we commemorate them. So in the Middle Ages, there are different approaches to the question of what is a miracle. When Maimonides, the arch-rationalist philosopher who tries to integrate parts of Aristotelian philosophy that he thinks can match or live comfortably with what the Torah teaches, he has a challenge when it comes to the question of miracles, because many of the big miracles in the Torah, let's say the splitting of the Red Sea, or what happened, the miracle when the Jewish people entered at the beginning of the book of Joshua to cross into Eretz Yisrael, when the Jordan also had a splitting, the Jordan River, or back to a biblical miracle of drawing water out of a rock, or manna from heaven, right? All of those big miracles share in common that they are unnatural, right? They go against the laws of nature. And that caused a philosophical challenge to Maimonides and to other medieval thinkers, because what do you do with something that goes against the laws of nature? If God created the world and set the world in motion with the rules of nature, how do we understand what it means when God intervenes in history and for a given moment, for a given group of people, for a given reason, God decides to change nature? And Maimonides found various sources in earlier rabbinic literature which helped him grapple with the question of big changes in nature, which we call miracles. And what he proposed was that actually at the time of creation, part of what God did in creating the world was embed in different creations the potential that they might need to change. So for example, right, when the Red Sea was created, when God created the sea, the water, and then gathered it into bodies of water, the seas and the oceans, when God created the water at the time of creation, he created the Red Sea with the potential that it could turn dry at a moment when God would decide and then be able to help the Jewish people cross. Similarly, Maimonides, the Rambam, explains that all of the other big change of nature miracles are actually nothing new happening in the world. They're God bringing into reality what he had already set as a potential possibility at the time of creation. An alternative approach, not necessarily contradictory, an alternative approach was offered in the 13th century by the Spanish scholar Nachmanides, known as the Ramban, and he gave a very interesting approach. He suggests that in the Torah we read about many revealed miracles. But what about, right, that would, like the examples that we just named, but what about, right, all of those generations that don't have revealed miracles happening to them, right? Most of us haven't had manna fall from heaven for breakfast, right, or water come out of a rock, right? Most of us haven't had a sea split in order for us to get across it. It doesn't work that way. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, suggests that in many generations, when God chose to perform a public big miracle, that came to teach a certain religious truth. But in generations that don't have those big public miracles, the Torah commands us many times that there are several mitzvot that we should perform because they function as a sign. They function as a reminder. Anybody know any examples of mitzvot that the Torah calls a sign or a remembrance or a reminder? The Hebrew words are ot and zikaron. Anybody know any of those mitzvot? Tefillin, right? The phylacteries are called an ot and a zikaron, a sign and a remembrance. Shabbat is also called a sign. The mezuzah on the doorposts is also called such a sign. And Nachmanides suggests that the function of those mitzvot is to serve us as a reminder of the same religious truths that big miracles could have served. So for those of us living in generations where we don't have daily manna from heaven, we still have certain mitzvot in our life, certain commandments in our Jewish ritual life that function as a sign, as a reminder, and they can teach us the same big truths that we could have learned if we would have had the Red Sea split in front of us today. But then Nachmanides continues his theory of miracles, and he explains that much of the world as we know it is also a miracle. It's just not a big revealed miracle like manna from heaven or like the splitting of the sea. For example, having good health, right? Having food on the table if you go to work, right? Most of the things that we take for granted in life and call nature and normal, says Nachmanides, are actually miracles, but they're hidden miracles. And they also come to teach us those same big religious truths of providence, that God's watching us and that God rewards. But those hidden miracles, right, come according to the normative laws of nature. So again, what we see are two different medieval approaches. One is Maimonides, the Rambam, who focuses primarily on those big miracles, those big public miracles, which look to us like nature is changing or suspending the rules of nature in order for this miraculous event to happen. And in order to resolve some larger philosophical issues, Maimonides teaches that really those changes to nature were set as potential at the time of creation. And what God does at that moment when the miracle happens is bring that potential into reality. So we have potential becoming something real when God decides. God chooses to decide and intervene and lets nature change according to its own nature. That's how Maimonides discusses the big public miracles. Nachmanides speaks about the big public miracles as having the function to change nature. He doesn't go in the direction Maimonides focuses on, but to do that in order to teach people or the nation at that time some big religious truth, to show them that God's involved, to show them that God rewards, to show them that God has chosen the Jewish people. You pick the reason at the time. And for all of the generations in which God's not going to perform such a big change of nature, says Nachmanides, God commanded us various mitzvot, various Torah commandments, which we should perform in order to serve us as a reminder, as a sign of those same big religious principles. So, for example, when we keep Shabbat, what big religious truth are we committing to and admitting that we believe in? That God created the world in 7 days. So we don't have a miracle coming to teach us that truth. We have our weekly reminder to keep that truth in mind. Similarly, the tefillin, the phylacteries, says Nachmanides, they come in order to replace, right, the big experience of the Exodus from Egypt. That can't happen in every generation, but we have this reminder mitzvah called the tefillin that teach us those same truths. It keeps us remembering that we received this mitzvah when we left Egypt and God set the Jewish people free and intervened in Jewish history to turn the Jewish people into a nation. Those are the public miracles. But then Nachmanides develops this thesis that so much of what we call nature is also miraculous. Rain, food, crops, good health, no pandemics, right? All of that, says Nachmanides, is also miraculous. And those are the hidden miracles in life. And they come to teach us the same religious truths as those big mega miracles that we don't have anymore, or we don't have in every generation. So according to Nachmanides, miracles come to teach us various religious truths. Most generations don't get big public miracles, so therefore they have certain mitzvot to keep us remembering those big miracles and the teachings that we can learn from them. Plus, we always have the hidden miracles in our life, right? Health, rain, food, peace. And those, says Nachmanides, also teach us about reward and punishment, about God watching the world. And it's over those miracles that people who are familiar with the Amidah service, right, the 18-19 blessing prayer that we say 3 times a day, and then also in a variant on Shabbat and holidays. At the end of the Amidah, we have the blessing of thanksgiving, the third to final blessing. And in that blessing, which opens with the words, Modim anachnu lach, we give thanks to you, God, there we speak about the miracles that you perform for us daily. So we're not talking about the splitting of the sea or the manna, right? We don't have those anymore. We're talking about the Ramban hidden miracles category of all of the things in our life which really are miraculous, but people too often think they are natural, right? And they're the way the world should be. So that's a little bit about medieval Jewish thought on the concept of a miracle. So what about the Hanukkah miracle, right? What was the Hanukkah miracle? Or as we'll see tonight, what were the Hanukkah miracles, right? And I put here a little word cloud with various words that if I was able to have everybody be able to speak, right? These are probably some of the words that you would call out to describe or to start to tell the story of the Hanukkah miracle. Together, we'll try to understand a little bit of the historical background to the story. And we'll try to see a little bit how many miracles and what happened when. So where do we know about the miracles? We have a text in the Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, in the tractate of Shabbat. And it's interesting, right? There is no tractate called Hanukkah. not in the Mishnah, and not in the Talmud, even though, as we opened and said, Hanukkah is a rabbinic holiday. Interesting. The discussion of Hanukkah comes in a very brief passage in Masachet Shabbat, in the Tractate of Shabbat, in the context of the wicks and the oils that are permissible for Shabbat candles. And then the Talmud moves into a discussion which ones of those, right, or what are the wicks and what are the candles and oils that are acceptable for the other time we have to light, right? We have to light on Friday night, candles, and we have to light on Hanukkah. So they make the segue from Shabbat to Hanukkah in the context of what are the wicks and what are the oils that are permissible for Hanukkah. And it's in that context that the Talmud asks the question, what is Hanukkah? Or in Aramaic, my Hanukkah? Which most people think the Talmud is actually saying, wait, why do we have Hanukkah? But I read a very important explanation that suggests that it's probably asking the question, why do we have the Hanukkah candles, right? That's the context in the Talmud. What are we allowed to light for the Shabbat candles? And what are we allowed to light for the Hanukkah candles? And the next question says, okay, so why do we light Hanukkah candles? Right? Because we don't have candles for Passover or candles for Shavuot or candle lighting for Sukkot, right? On those holidays, we have other mitzvot. In other words, the question is, why did the rabbis who instituted the holiday of Hanukkah choose the act of candle lighting, right, to mark Hanukkah? What's this Hanukkah candle lighting all about? And the Talmud answers that this is what the sages taught, and they tell the story. On the 25th of the Hebrew month of Kislev, those are called the days of Hanukkah, because, and here's the story, the Greeks entered the temple, they polluted all the oils in the temple, and when the Hasmonean dynasty overcame and defeated them, they checked and they found but one cruse, one little jug of oil that was set in place with the seal of the high priest to indicate that it was not defiled. But there was only enough light for one day. A miracle was done with it, and they lit it for 8 days. And then the next year, the rabbis instituted that those 8 days would be days of praise and thanksgiving. So if we stopped here and we said, what does the Talmud tell us about the miracle of Hanukkah? It names one, right? And it names the miracle of the jug of oil that instead of lasting for one day, lasted for 8 days, right? And the background, which we still have to do the nitty-gritty of the background, it tells us that it's connected to the period of the Greeks, right? Connected to the temple, connected to the Hasmonean dynasty. We'll put all of this in order in the coming minutes. That's the main rabbinic passage about Hanukkah. But what's interesting is that in our tefillah, in our prayers, and in the Birkat Hamazon, in the grace after meals, we include a passage for the 8 days of Hanukkah in which we describe the miracles and we give thanksgiving to God for the miracle, over the miracles. So let's look at that passage, and I'll be interested if anybody wants to write in the chat, right? What miracle of Hanukkah is spoken about in this passage? I brought only the opening lines in the Hebrew and the full text in the English, right? The opening lines open with the words Al Hanisim. We're giving thanks to God for the miracles, and then we have several synonyms for miracles and salvations that God performed for our ancestors way back when, at this season. And those opening lines, these two opening lines, right, 2 in Hebrew, 3 in English, right, those are the same for Purim and for Hanukkah. What we've changed, right, the 2 rabbinic holidays, what we change is this longer paragraph, which I only brought you in the English, in which we explain what are the miracles and the great might, acts of might and the saving acts, right, and the wonders that God performed. I'll stop in a minute and read the chats, right, that God performed for our ancestors back at that time in this season. And we tell the story. In the days of Matityahu, the son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean, and his sons, again, we have to put all of this into historical context. When the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel, to make them forget your Torah and violate the decrees of your will. But you, God, in your abounding mercies, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended their rights, and avenged the wrong done to them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with your Torah. You made a great and holy name for yourself in your world, and effected a great deliverance and redemption for your people Israel to this very day. Then your children entered the shrine of your house, the temple, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, kindled your lights in your holy courtyards, and instituted these 8 days of Hanukkah to give thanks and praise to your great name. According to this prayer, which we recite, as I said, in the Birkat Hamazon after meals and the grace after meals, as well as in the Amidah, what's the focus? Which miracles are we speaking about? Oh, sorry, 1 second. Somebody want to speak or write in the chat? What's the focus here? I was trying to get to the chat. That's how I lost the share screen. It's not letting me open it. I'm sorry. Somebody wrote a long chat and it's just not letting me open it unless I stop the share. I don't know why.
You could stop the share for a minute and then
maybe you could, can you just please read us the chat? Sorry.
Sure.
Thanks. Somebody wrote a long message, which I didn't get to answer.
Steve asked, just wondering if you could put miracles in perspective of the opposite of miracles, such as disasters, viruses, plagues, or other horrible things.
So exactly. Okay,
can it be a miracle without first having some terrible thing first? So would there be a Hanukkah miracle without events that preceded it? Do miracles ever happen when things are going well?
Interesting. Now, miracles are, call it need-based, right? They're need-based intervention. Right? There's a certain need for a certain either person or group of people, right? Or an entire nation. And God chooses to intervene and do something to resolve the need. So it doesn't always have to be disaster, right? Sometimes it's danger, sometimes it's lack of food, sometimes it's lack of water, right? And God chooses to intervene. That's when that's when we use the concept of a miracle. Okay. Did anybody write in the chat or anybody want to speak up, right? What's the focus here in this Al Hanisim passage, in this prayer? Is it like the Talmud, which highlighted the miracle of the little cruse of oil? Do we hear about that here? No. Right, what's the primary focus here? The battles, right? God delivering the few into the hands of the many, the good guys into the hands of the bad guys.
Esther
right?
says redemption.
So redemption is a very big word, right? Redemption can mean the words that we have here, salvation and transformation, right? It's not what we call redemption with a capital R, right? Like the period of the Messiah, which is a completely different topic than today's class. So redemption's can be a synonym, right? Here it says that you effected a great deliverance and redemption. This is the Chabad translation. Again, those are good synonyms for being saved, right? But the actual miracle that we're talking about here is the military victory of the people that we're going to learn about in a minute. Right? So we have one rabbinic text that highlights the miracle, and it says explicitly, that's the passage we studied in the Talmud, that the miracle of Hanukkah, for which the holiday was instituted, is the miracle of that little jug of oil that should have lasted only 1 day and lasted 8 days. And for that, the rabbis instituted an 8-day holiday. And for that, we give praise and thanksgiving for 8 days. And we light the candles for 8 days. This passage, the Al Hanisim prayer, focuses primarily on the military battles and the victory and redemption and salvation that the Jewish people faced and met instead of destruction. And in the final lines, it highlights that as a result of that miraculous victory, Then the Jewish people were able to go into the temple, rededicate it, purify it, and light the candles. But it doesn't say anything here about the miracle of the jug of oil. Interesting. So we have two different texts, two different emphases on what the miracles are. We'll come back to that after we talk a little bit about the historical background to the Hanukkah story. So what we know from the texts that we've seen, we're talking about the Greeks. We're talking about somebody named here Matityahu, right? He's a high priest. Let's talk a little bit about the historical background. In order to understand the historical background of the Hanukkah story, we have to go back a bit. The parts that I put of the timeline in red, those are the parts that specifically connect to the Hanukkah story. But in order to understand it, we have to be able to put it in context. And the context of the Hanukkah story begins with the destruction of the first temple and actually ends with the destruction of the second temple. The Hanukkah story is this, right? The Hanukkah story, if people can please mute, the Hanukkah story is this peak moment, right? This highlight moment between two destructions. So let's talk a little bit about the background, right? The first temple was built by Solomon, King Solomon, son of King David, and lasted close to 400 years, but, right, the first temple was a period in which, first of all, we have the splitting of the Jewish monarchy. What began with a unified monarchy split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom with the 10 tribes, known as the Kingdom of Israel, with the capital in Samaria, Shomron, and the southern kingdom, the Kingdom of Judah, with the tribe of Judah, one other tribe, in the south of Israel. The temple that Solomon built was in the southern kingdom, in the Kingdom of Judah, and the tribes in the north set up alternative worship sites and actually put up roadblocks. The first king of the northern kingdom put up roadblocks to block the ways to Jerusalem so that the people from his kingdom cannot go to worship in the Jerusalem-based temple. And during the period of the first temple, we have the parallel tracks of these two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah. And in the books of Kings and in Chronicles, books in the Bible, we hear about the different kings of these two kingdoms. We hear who the good guys were, who the bad guys were, and you're on the good guy or bad guy list according to these biblical books, depending on your loyalty to God and how much you kept the Torah and the laws of the Torah and how much you stayed away from idolatry. Many of the kings, many of the people in both kingdoms flirted with idolatry or went past flirtation and actually left God and made the choice to worship idols. But in addition, the period of the first temple is full of other sins, full of sins of interpersonal, a breakdown of society, interpersonal sins, murder, theft, the breakdown of the justice system. And the first temple period is noted with many prophets that spoke to the kings, warning them that if they don't shape up and start to observe the Torah, God's not going to let them stay in the land. They'll be kicked out of the land. The temple will be destroyed, and it will be really bad. The northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed first, sent into exile, and God continues to send prophets who warn the southern kingdom that your end is going to be the same if you don't shape up. Otherwise, you'll ship out, you'll be destroyed. And the first temple destruction comes in 586 BCE with the Babylonians from the northeast coming, laying siege on Jerusalem, destroying the temple, burning the temple and most of the city, and taking the majority of the remnant of the Kingdom of Judah into exile to Babylonia. But they go into exile with a promise of the prophet Jeremiah. They go into exile with the prophecy that 70 years from now, they'll come back. Some people think 70 years sounds like a very short time. Other people think 70 years sounds like a long time. In history, a lot can happen in 70 years. If anybody knows what happened to the Jews who stayed in communist countries during the 70 years of communism, quite a lot changed. And not very much was left of Judaism 70 years later. And what's interesting is that the Jews who went into exile in Babylonia received the prophecy when they went that 70 years from now, they'll be coming back. And that happened. The Babylonian Empire fell, was replaced by the Persian Empire, and Cyrus, king of Persia, issued an edict around 520, allowing anybody who wants to leave Babylon and go back to Jerusalem and start to rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls, rebuild the economy, rebuild society. And he offered them not only royal permission, he also offered them some funding, right? Crowdfunding, and he offered them, right, that they could get certain benefits. They could take money and resources out of Babylonia, which you might not have been able to do, and go. And he even gave them a leader, an officially sanctioned leader, to go and lead the process. We know from the final books of the Bible that the response was not, overwhelming. The majority of the Jewish people chose very comfortable lives to stay in Babylonia, not to risk the adventures of what it would be like to go back and rebuild and start again. And many of the Jews in Babylonia were quite assimilated, and so they didn't even really feel much of a pull to pick up and pack their bags and make Aliyah and go back to Jerusalem and risk what it would be like going. The groups of returnees who come have a difficult time. They have physical building to do. They have economic building to do. They have tension with the inhabitants of the land. During those 70 years, other people have lived in the land, and they're not so happy to see the former inhabitants coming back. They view it as as a possible occupation. They're not too happy with that. And there's a lot of tension. The kings of Persia have to intervene many times. And there are several rounds of returning to Zion. Sorry for the double two. And it's during this period, which lasts about 100 years, this period of the return. Right? Some of the leaders are maybe known to you, Ezra and Nehemiah, for example. During this period, the returnees lay the foundation of the Second Temple. And actually the crowd there has a very interesting response. The elders who remember the first temple from 70 years ago, they started to cry. They said, this is nothing compared to the glory of what the first temple was supposed to be. And the young people were hooting and hollering. They thought this was just great, this new foundation of the temple to be laid. And the book of Ezra describes that tension between the older and the younger. And God sent 3 prophets to speak to this group of returnees and to encourage them and to give them hope that this difficult enterprise called return and rebuilding is going to bear fruit, and that the second temple will be even more glorious than the first, and that this will work, and that God really wants this to work. An example of one of these prophets is the prophet that we'll read this Shabbat in the Haftarah, the special passage after the Torah reading, the prophet Zechariah. And we'll read one of his visions of encouragement to the returnees. And if you read the Haftarah carefully, you'll see how he uses the image of the candelabra, the menorah, from the temple as well. So we have this period of return and great hope, but we have the majority of the Jewish people living back in Babylonia. And then the Persian Empire, which had ruled over the Middle East, falls when Alexander the Great conquers most of the known world. Alexander the Great from Macedonia, from Greece, and his conquests spread across the known world. He conquers Eretz Yisrael, Judea, the former kingdom of Judea, in the 4th century. And then he dies young, unexpected, and his empire is divided between 4 of his generals. And it's this period of the division of Alexander the Great's empire that we continue to call the Greek period, even though, right, these 4 different sub-empires, right, are not all based in Greece anymore. Right? They came from the empire of Alexander the Great in Greece, and now they rule over much of the known world, Asia, Africa, parts of Europe, and they have different centers, right? That's why there are 4 different subsections. The section of the Greek Empire that rules over Eretz Yisrael, the former kingdom of Judea, is the Seleucid branch of the Greek Empire. And they're based in Syria, which is why you might often hear that the Hanukkah story takes place with the Syrian Greeks. Right? Well, how are there Syrian Greeks? Well, now you know, right? The Greek Empire split into 4 centers, but it's still Greek as far as culture and influence, but it's based in 4 different centers, one of which is Syria. So the Syrian Greeks, right, who then conquer Eretz Yisrael, continue to spread Greek culture. What's Greek culture? That's what we call Hellenism, worship of the body, paganism, polytheism, many, many different gods, worship of human beings as opposed to one God, and right, a sense that people all around need to share the same culture. There's no multiculturalism here. There's no religious tolerance. Everybody needs to do the same. And that's the background to the Hanukkah story. The ruler at the time of the Hanukkah story is Antiochus IV of the Seleucid dynasty. And when he comes to the throne, he issues multiple decrees to continue to unite his empire. And one of the populations that he's particularly concerned about are the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, in the former kingdom of Judea. And he wants to make sure that they will be as Greek, right, as his Greek citizens in Syria and as Greeks in other parts of the empire, in Egypt or in Africa or in Greece. And in order to do that, he issues many different decrees. We'll skip a slide to some of his decrees. He dedicates the temple to Zeus, the Greek god. He bans the daily Tamid sacrifices in the temple. He bans observing Shabbat and the new moon. The new moon holiday, Rosh Chodesh, is important because that sets the Jewish calendar. So by banning the establishment of the calendar, right, in essence, he says you can't now observe any of the laws. You can't be different than us. You don't need a Jewish calendar. Follow our calendar. He bans circumcision and he forces Jews to bow down to idols and to eat pig meat. And his decrees start in 167 BCE, and they last close to 3 years. And it's during that time that a small group rebel against him. The majority of the Jews in the province of Judea are pretty comfortable being Greeks and continuing their Greek influence for the last 100 years. They are quite willing to adopt many of the decrees of King Antiochus. A small group of what we would call extremists, rebels, but actually they're arch conservatives with a little c, is not willing to accept this. And they say, we're Jews. We can live under the Greeks. We can live under the Persians. We can live under the Babylonians, but we need to keep the Torah and we do what we have to do and we're distinct. And it's this small group who we call the Maccabees who revolted, and they led little militias, not the same size as the Greek army. And that's what we read about in the Al Nisim prayer, the defeat of the many in the hands of the few, right? That these small militias could take on the larger Syrian Greek army of Antiochus and win the battles. And that's we'll come in a minute to some of the details, right? But that's the time frame in which the Hanukkah story happens. So the 3 years of the decrees end with the successful revolt of this group of people, extremists, small minority, and the rededication of the temple, taking out the statue of Zeus and rededicating and restarting temple worship. And then those rebels, right, who revolted against King Antiochus, they and their descendants continue to rule into the 1st century, right, another close to 200 years. The end of that time is a lot of civil war, a lot of murder, a lot of intrigue, difficult period in the family there. And it culminates with the conquest of the Romans, right? The entry of Roman rule into Eretz Yisrael, ending in the destruction of the Second Temple. So what we've seen is that the Hanukkah story is bracketed between, right, bracketed by the destruction of the First Temple, going into exile, some people coming back, the challenges of return, building, hoping that what you're building is going to be meaningful and worthwhile and long-lasting. And then, right, the Greeks conquering, Alexander the Great conquering the Near East, conquering Eretz Yisrael, dying, his empire being divided. The force of the Greeks from Syria conquers Eretz Yisrael, and part of the spread of Hellenic culture, of Greek culture, includes many of these decrees which ban Jewish observance, the most basic parts of Jewish observance, leading to the revolt of the Maccabees, led by Matityahu, the high priest, and his 5 sons. And they lead these small militia bands which fight the great Greek Empire and succeed. And we call that, right, the miracle of Hanukkah, the first miracle of Hanukkah, that the few could defeat the many, the good guys, right, who were loyal to the Torah, could defeat the bad guys, the Greeks, who were aiming to break down Jewish observance. And as a result of their military defeat, part of their military defeat was that they could enter Jerusalem, rededicate the temple, clean it out from Zeus and all of the other idols, and begin to reinstate the rituals and the obligations of temple service. One of the rituals of the temple is lighting the candelabra, the menorah, morning and night. And for that, you need pure olive oil. And that is the second miracle of Hanukkah, that they found in this defiled temple one jar with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, of the previous high priest, that said this is pure. And now, as a result, they could perform one more of the rituals of temple service and light the menorah. But that one jug, right, should have only lasted 1 day. And there we have the second miracle, that this jug that they found burned for 8 days. And during those 8 days, there was time to press more olives that would be pure and not dedicated to Zeus or idolatry, and be able to have new pure olive oil come to the rededicated temple. And it's for both of those miracles that we have the Hanukkah holiday, 8 days of thanksgiving and gratitude to God, as well as the reenactment of the lighting, right? And that's why the mitzvah of the holiday is to light, and to light every day. So here we lit the first candle tonight. I'll wish you all Hanukkah Sameach. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stay on. I wanted to keep to the time frame.